Hello there, Sonia here, and I welcome you to another session of Grammar Forward. Today we are going to deal with another important part of speech called verbs. In our previous sessions, we have already dealt with other parts of speech like nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. So let's try to know more about verbs. Verbs are words that describe an action, state, or occurrence. They can take many different forms depending on their subjects, the time they refer to, and the different ideas we want to express. Verbs can be thought of as the heart of a sentence because a sentence needs at least a verb. Let's talk about this in detail. As I told you, a verb can be used to describe an action. For instance, in the sentence, the little boy jumped up and down, we know that the subject is the boy because he is the one who did the action. And what is the action that he did? He jumped up and down. So that is a verb, and here the verb refers to a physical activity. But in some other cases, verbs are also used to describe a state of being or a feeling. Thus, in the example, she likes chocolates, the subject is she, and she doesn't do anything physically there. She likes chocolates. So, likes is a verb which just describes a feeling. In yet another example, when I say, he became a popular actor, the verb is became, and he is a subject, but you know that the subject he didn't do anything physically there. He became an actor. So, in this case, the verb is used just to describe an occurrence. Now let's talk about the different types of verbs. In fact, verbs can be classified in several ways, and one way of classifying them is as action verbs or stative verbs. An action verb, as the name suggests, is a word that describes an action. They are also called dynamic verbs, and they typically denote any physical action or a mental activity which is done or controlled by a doer in the sentence, and we call this doer the subject. Action verbs can be used in any tense like the past tense or the present tense or the future tense. We can also use them in any of the forms like the simple, the continuous, or the perfect. So examples for action verbs can be play, talk, laugh, eat, drink, walk, and so on. Stative verbs or state verbs, on the other hand, describe a state rather than an action. These verbs describe a subject's state of being or feelings, including things they like or dislike. Thus, verbs of perception, opinion, senses, emotions, possession, thoughts, state of being are all stative verbs. Stative verbs are usually not used in the continuous form. Examples for stative verbs can be need, want, prefer, like, dislike, know, understand, and so on. In the example, this perfume smells good. We are talking about a perfume, and that's a subject. And the verb is smells. It describes the state of being of the perfume, and hence it's called a stative verb. In the second sentence, we need some help. We is a subject, and the verb need describes the mental state of the subject. So it's called a stative verb again. Stative verbs often relate to thoughts and opinions. Examples can be agree, believe, doubt, know, understand, and so on. So for example, we can say, I believe you are doing well, and we are not allowed to say, I am believing you are doing well, because you know that believe is a stative verb and we cannot use it in the continuous form. Some stative verbs refer to feelings and emotions. For example, we have verbs like, dislike, hate, love, prefer, want, wish, and so on. So for example, we are allowed to say Tim likes cars, but we are not permitted to say Tim is liking cars. Verbs can also relate to senses and perceptions. Examples are look, see, hear, taste, feel, be, appear, and so on. For example, it's correct to say, I hear some music playing, but you are not allowed to say, I am hearing some music playing, because in this case, hear is a stative verb and we cannot use a stative verb in the continuous form. Some stative verbs may also refer to measurement and possession. Examples for such verbs include belong, own, possess, weigh, measure, and so on. So an example for the right usage of such a verb is she owns a beautiful car, and it's wrong to say she is owning a beautiful car. There is something very interesting here. Some verbs can be dynamic or stative. And this is because some verbs have more than one meaning, and these verbs can refer to states or actions depending on a context. To make this point clear, let's have some examples. Here we have a pair of sentences, and the first one goes like this. I think that's a great idea. This sentence expresses an opinion, and the verb think refers to a mental state. That means we cannot use it in the continuous form. The second sentence is, we are thinking about moving to another city. In this sentence, the speaker is actively processing his thoughts about something, or there's a kind of action in progress. So the verb think is an action verb. That's why we use it in the continuous form. Now on to another pair of sentences. The first one is, they have a beautiful house. In this case, have is the verb, but you know that it shows possession. So it's a stative verb and we cannot use it in the continuous form. But in the next sentence, I'm having lunch now. The verb having means eating, so it's an action verb and we can use it in the continuous form. Verbs are also classified as main verbs and auxiliary verbs. Main verbs are sometimes called principal verbs or lexical verbs. It is the main verb that usually shows the action or the state of being of a subject. It can stand alone, which means it doesn't depend on another verb. Let's take up some examples. In the first sentence you have, he watered the plants. Here he is a subject and the verb is watered. You know that watered is a main verb, it stands alone. In the second sentence you have, I know her well. Here the subject is I and know is the verb, it's a main verb. But did you notice something? In the first sentence you have watered, which is an action verb, and the second sentence you have know, which is a stative verb. So this shows that regardless of whether it's an action verb or a stative verb, a main verb always stands alone. Now moving on to the other category called auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs are also called helping verbs. Auxiliary verbs help or support the main verbs in different ways. There are two kinds of auxiliary verbs, primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs. Primary auxiliary verbs are verbs like be, do, and have. These auxiliary verbs help the main verb to show its tense and also to form negatives or questions. An important point to note is that primary auxiliary verbs can function both as a helping verb and a main verb. So in the example, I have a car, you know that have is the only verb and it's a main verb because it shows possession or ownership. And the second sentence, I have seen her, seen is the main verb, but have is only helping this main verb. To better understand how helping verbs support main verbs, let's take up some examples. In the first sentence you have, she is sleeping. Sleeping is the main verb and is the helping verb or auxiliary verb. And this helping verb indicates that the action takes place now, in the present time. But in the next example you have she was sleeping. Here again sleeping is the main verb but was is the helping verb, and it's clear that the action took place in the past. Thus, helping verbs is and was help to indicate the time of the action. Please don't forget that the three primary auxiliary verbs are be, do, and have. And these auxiliary verbs help the main verbs in the formation of questions and negatives. For example, in a sentence, he is reading, you know that reading is the main verb and is the helping verb. In order to make it negative, you just have to add the word not to the helping verb. So it becomes he is not reading. In another example, you have she visited me yesterday. In order to make it a question, you have to add the helping verb did because you have the past tense she visited. So you add the helping verb did and you have did she visit you yesterday? We are done with primary auxiliary verbs and let's take up modal auxiliary verbs. Modal auxiliary verbs combine with other verbs to indicate modality. They can express ability, possibility, probability, obligation, permission, and so on. Modal auxiliary verbs never change form. Here is a complete list of all the modal verbs. We have will, would, can, could, may, might, shall, should, ought to, and must. Let's look at this pair of sentences. In the first sentence you have she can sing. Here the main verb is sing and the modal verb is can. You know that can indicates ability. But in the next sentence you have she will sing. The main verb is sing but the modal verb is will, which shows certainty. Thus it's clear that the modality of the verb changes according to the modal verb used. Verbs can also be classified as transitive and intransitive verbs. Let's begin with transitive first. Transitive verbs are those which require an object to complete its meaning. Simply put, such verbs pass on the action done by the subject to the object. For example, when I say she ate an apple, she is a subject, she ate, so ate is a verb, and what does she eat? An apple. Apple is the object. But when I say he played, you know that the subject is there and played, the verb is also there, but still the meaning is not complete. That's because the object is missing. But when I say he played tennis, it makes sense. That's because the verb played is a transitive verb. On the contrary, you have verbs called intransitive verbs. These verbs don't require a direct object to complete their meaning. Examples can be smile, talk, walk, laugh, cry, and so on. So when someone asks you, how did you get here so quickly? You just reply, I ran. Because ran is an intransitive verb and it doesn't require an object. You can run without transferring the action of running onto a direct object. So other examples can be, the baby was crying. Cry is an intransitive verb. Similarly, you have, they laughed uncontrollably. Laugh again is an intransitive verb. A word of caution here, some verbs can be very tricky. They can be transitive and intransitive depending on the situation. That is, in some instances, such a verb may need an object, but in some others, they don't require an object. For example, let's have a look at these sentences. In the first one, you have, I stopped the car. The subject is I and I stopped. I stopped what? The car. So the verb stopped has an object which is the car. That means stopped is a transitive verb. But in the next sentence you have the car stopped. Here car is a subject and what did the car do? It stopped. But ask the question, what did it stop? You don't have an answer because the verb stopped doesn't take an object here. That's because stopped is an intransitive verb here. In another sentence you have, I grow vegetables in my garden. So I Grow. So grow is a subject, and what do I grow? I grow vegetables. You have an answer. So grow is a transitive verb. But in the next sentence you have, my daughter is growing quickly. So my daughter is a subject, and what is she doing? She is growing. You ask the question, what is she growing? You don't have an answer. That's because in the second case, grow is an intransitive verb. Now it's time for some tips. These tips will help you to avoid the common mistakes made while using verbs. Tip number 1. Never use the modal auxiliary verbs with the primary auxiliary verbs such as be, do, and have. Thus, it's correct to say, I cannot walk fast, but it's incorrect to say, I don't can walk fast. Now moving on to tip number 2. Unlike auxiliary verbs, modal verbs never change form. They cannot be inflected. So you can say, she can speak English well, but it's wrong to say, she can speak English well. Tip number 3 now. We don't use the continuous form of stative verbs. So we can say, this cake tastes delicious, not this cake is tasting delicious. On to the last tip. We never use the infinitive of a verb after a modal verb. It's right to say, you should work hard, but you're not permitted to say, you should to work hard. I hope you found this session of Grammar Forward helpful. If so, please do subscribe to my channel. Meet you in the next session. Goodbye until then. Take care and stay safe.